Welcome and good morning. On behalf of the entire UC Berkeley community, thank you for taking the time to join us here today. My name is Blas Perez Enriquez, and I direct the Center for Environmental Public Policy at the Goldman School here at Berkeley. I first want to thank my co-chair, Professor Betty Deaking. She promised she's on her way. I don't see her in the room. But, I'm a newbie in this area of urban planning and environmental design, so her guidance has been invaluable as we shape the agenda for today. Last December, we also hosted an academic symposium about the environmental and other co-benefits of developing a high-speed rail system here in California. And after what I learned then from my colleagues, I'm now very, very interested in the intersection of transportation, urban development, and sustainability, but particularly in helping address some of the policy questions that the high-speed mega project presents to California. I hope we can continue fostering interdisciplinary research and dialogue about high-speed rail in this campus and across the UC system. Some of the contributors to our symposium will be presenting their work at this conference. Their working papers are available in the CEPP website and will be included in the gift we have for all of those who stay for both days of this event. I also want to thank our partners, who without their support, this conference would have not become a reality. Our academic partner, UC Berkeley's Institute of Urban and Regional Development, Robert Cervero, its director is here. Thank you, Robert. Two groups that, among other ideas, they promote smart growth and transport-oriented development, the San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Association, SPUR, and Transform. And last but not least, the French National Railway Corporation, SNCF, for their generous support. At a time when there seems to be little faith in government's ability to build big, and with public finances in trouble, California is ready to create a high-speed rail that might transform the way we travel. California voters already elected to take out nearly $10 billion in loans in 2008 to pay for this project. In 2009, the Obama administration granted funding in support of the first high-speed rail developments across the US. Additional federal support might not be there for a while. And the whole system will cost California somewhere between $42 and $45 billion, according to the current estimates. So if we are about to spend such kind of money, we better do this right. Our goal for this conference is to provide a platform, a neutral forum, to discuss the next stage of policy design and implementation towards development of a high-speed rail for California. With California's population estimated to reach between 70 billion by 2050, non-conventional modes of transportation with less ecological footprint must be considered to meet the increased demand for transportation. Is high-speed rail the answer? Stick around for the next 2 days and we'll find out. Through this conference, we will explore high-speed rail environmental impact vis-a-vis other transportation modes, local, regional, and statewide economic development opportunities, and hear lessons from international experiences with high-speed rail. It is now my pleasure to introduce our opening keynote speaker, a man who in this crowd needs little introduction, Congressman Jim Oberstar. As a member of Congress from 1975 to 2011, he chaired the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. Congressman Oberstar is one of our nation's leading experts on transportation policy. He joins us from our UC DC Center. Congressman, the floor is yours.
Grand merci, cher ami Blas Enriquez. C'était un grand plaisir de faire votre connaissance au cours des événements et des discussions au CONAM et au sein de la SNCF. And for those who need translation, I just said big thank you for the opportunity to get to know you at the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers at French University in Paris, and meetings with the SNCF in March. And thank you for inviting me to this conference. And thanks to all of you who are gathering for this event. I wish I could be with you in person, but I have other commitments here in Washington this week. This is the most important and hopeful moment of the last 40 years for high-speed rail in America. We created Amtrak, but put it on life support 40 years ago. President Obama has laid out a bold, innovative, and forceful initiative and committed to substantial, sustainable investment in high-speed passenger rail for the future. We have an opportunity. We must not fail the traveling public once again. There was a time, not long ago, when the train was the preferred means of travel in our country. Before trains, we had rivers, canals, horse-drawn carriages to move people and goods across our country. But in 1830, the nation's first passenger and freight railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, revolutionized transportation in America. Overnight, the locomotive became a symbol for travel, for adventure, for efficiency, and a carrying capacity we had never seen before. By 1840, 2,818 miles of track had been laid. By the start of the Civil War, we had over 30,000 miles of rail track in this country. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad joined East and West when the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific pounded that golden spike near Ogden, Utah. By 1910, trains carried 90% of all intercity passenger travel. The railroads didn't do this all on their own, however. From 1833 through 1871, the federal government gave the railroads 8% of the total land surface of the United States, 173 million acres, to develop a rail network, to build stations, depots, machine shops, side tracks, turnouts, water stations, and the right to own the mineral values below ground and the timber above ground, and to sell that land. And they did. And we saw from those land grants that we created billionaires, not in that time, but in today's real dollar amount, billionaires. And when the railroads pose objections and resistance and say, we've done this with our private sector investment, keep that in mind. When I held hearings on this subject a couple of years ago, projected on the map in our committee room all the mileage of rail operation that was given to the railroads in that 30-plus year period of time. And we gave them part of the common heritage of all Americans for the public use, convenience, and necessity to serve this country and improve transportation. It's time for them to participate and partner with us in creating a new transportation future for America. The success of the passenger railroad system began to slip by the mid-20th century. Mass production of cars, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the increasing availability, comfort, and convenience of air travel, increasing train fares and decreasing service, and a host of railroad bankruptcies, mergers, acquisitions, all took their toll on passenger service in America. By 1970, airlines owned 73% of the passenger travel market, railroads 7.3%. Congress needed to take immediate action or risk losing passenger rail altogether. We created the National Passenger Railroad Corporation, Amtrak. But as I said at the outset, we didn't give Amtrak the financing it needed to reinvigorate passenger train travel. We left it with dilapidated infrastructure, aging equipment, facilities long ago neglected, abandoned, and little government support to continue America's love of train travel. Over the course of 180 years, America went from being the world leader in passenger rail to dead last. Ou comme on dit dans le Tour de France, le lanterne rouge. As we say in the Tour de France, the red lantern, meaning the caboose of all passenger rail service in the world. But the tide has now turned for both Amtrak and for high-speed rail. The public is experiencing what many of us in Congress have seen coming for a good many years: congestion, crippling, choking our major cities and our small towns, and the aging infrastructure of our highway network. In the annual Texas Transportation Institute report on congestion, evaluating 80 major cities in America, the report for last year found the cost of congestion at $115 billion. That means 4.8 billion hours of delay. People are just sitting in traffic in the nation's major cities and even in some of our small towns. And 3.9 billion gallons of wasted fuel, equal to 130 days flow of the Alaskan pipeline. The average driver in 28 major metropolitan areas experienced 40 or more hours of delay a year last year. 29 years ago, Los Angeles was the only city in the country that had that level of congestion. Families are losing what little time they have together because of time sitting in traffic, picking up kids at daycare, running endless errands that are part of life in today's congested America. At the same time, the quality of our transportation system itself is deteriorating. Those assets of highways and bridges and urban and rural transit systems have a limited lifespan. Many segments of our highway and bridge infrastructure are reaching or have already reached their useful design life. 61,000 miles, 37% of all lane miles in the national highway system are in poor or fair condition. More than 151,000 bridges, 1 out of every 4, are structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. More than 32,500 public transit buses have exceeded their useful life. The nation's largest public transit agencies face an $80 billion infrastructure backlog just to bring their systems up to a state of good repair, let alone move ahead and accommodate greater passenger traffic. That is why we need a high-speed rail system in America. It offers safe, efficient, convenient, affordable transportation alternatives. And we, in this country, lag woefully behind the rest of the world in high-speed rail development. France, the very face of high-speed rail, now holds the world record for speed of steel-on-steel rail at 357 miles an hour. The French have used their high-speed rail system to lift entire regions of the country out of isolation, ignite growth, convert quiet towns into thriving tourist destinations. France is truly the high-speed rail envy of the world. Japan unveiled its high-speed rail system in 1964 and now has 1,350 miles of high-speed rail and is underway with a new Tokyo-Osaka line that will accommodate speeds of over 300 miles an hour. Spain changed the demographics of entire regions with its high-speed line from Madrid to Seville. In 1992, the line is so successful that more people traveled between the two cities by rail than by car or air combined. Spain has a plan, to spend $100 billion over the next 10 years to build Europe's largest, most expansive high-speed rail network. It will put nearly everyone in Spain within 30 miles of a train station and create tens of thousands of jobs and local economic opportunity. China has announced its plan to expand a high-speed rail system to a network of over 16,000 miles by 2020. They already have a 2,500-mile line that links Beijing to Lhasa, Tibet. You can travel it in 24 hours. The last 500 miles are at 14,000 feet altitude with pressurized rail cars and oxygen masks for passengers. China has, just in the last year, invested and committed $50 billion to its high-speed rail network. What are we, third world country? The only high-speed rail line in the U.S. is Amtrak's Acela between Washington and New York and Boston. It can achieve speeds of 135 miles an hour between Washington and New York for about 3 minutes. I've experienced it many times. and 150 miles an hour between New York and Boston, but it averages 88 miles an hour between Washington and New York, and 66 miles an hour between New York and Boston, because of congestion, track conditions, infrastructure deficiencies, catenaries that are over 100 years old that sag in the summer heat and and wilt under the 12,000 volt power coming from the locomotive. But even with those, let's call them modest speeds, Amtrak holds 69% of the air rail market between Washington and New York. People like to board Amtrak and take off their shoes only when they choose to do so, carry their liquids in their suitcase and not have to spill them out on the X-ray line. To be fair, the major difference between our rail network and those of France, Spain, China, and others is that our passenger trains have to operate on the same track with freight rail. And in most cases, freight has priority over passengers. And the freight rails are unwilling to share the cost of upgrading ties, track, switches, signals to support passenger rail service, even where that means it will improve their own freight service. In addition, the railroads insist, as a condition of allowing passenger trains to operate on the same track as their freight rail, they insist on freedom from any liability for passenger train accidents, including cases where the freight railroad itself may be at fault. So identifying projects that will have a dedicated right-of-way for high-speed rail is essential, but we have huge obstacles, huge problems to overcome in winning the support of the freight railroads, who are resistant even to sharing right-of-way, let alone giving up trackage for high-speed passenger rail. But the reality is that a high-speed rail system will go a long way to solving America's economic, energy, environmental, and goods movement and people movement challenges. These benefits do have a price tag. Let's be realistic about it. We know from the experience of other countries that a successful high-speed rail system requires significant financial commitment from governments. I've talked about those already. $50 billion from China just in the last year, $50 billion from Spain. Just last month, this time last, or in March rather, in Paris, I had meetings with the SNCF, the TGV, the Paris area metro and tram system, and their investment authority, which is planning over the next 5 years, $45 billion of investment in upgrading the Paris regional area tram, metro, and surface interconnecting passenger rail systems. The Paris metro carries 11 million people a day. This year is the 30th anniversary of the TGV. Next March, it will welcome its 2 billionth passenger. That's an astonishing number. Just compare France, country of roughly 60 million people, with Amtrak serving the entire United States and 29 million passengers last year. That was a great achievement for Amtrak, a 29% increase, but 29 million versus nearly 2 billion passengers. We can and we must do better. And we need that significant financial commitment from government. A few years ago, that was nearly impossible. Instead of providing Amtrak with funds needed to operate efficiently and modernize, the Bush administration proposed bankruptcy for Amtrak. We fought it, we resisted it, we had bipartisan support to keep Amtrak, but just keep it alive, just keep its nose above water. And then came the Passenger Rail Investment Improvement Act, the first reauthorization of Amtrak in 15 years in 2007, 2008. With Senator Boxer's support in California, as chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, we moved our bill first in the House. They were able to, following that tragic crash in California with 25 fatalities, Senator Boxer was able to arouse the Senate to do the right thing, and President Bush signed that bill into law. And then with the stimulus, following right on the heels, We are on the threshold of a rail renaissance, a transformative moment in the history of transportation in our country. With that passenger rail reauthorization of Amtrak, we laid a foundation for the first time in law for Amtrak with new high-speed rail planning, with development programs, with 11 designated corridors, and authorized, in addition to the funding for Amtrak, $1.5 billion for high-speed rail, and a process for including the private sector in high-speed rail development. The Stimulus Act provided $8 billion for the states with no state matching funds required. It was President Obama who laid that on the table and said, Joe Biden and I came to Washington on a train for the inaugural. We have to have passenger rail service in this Stimulus Act. It's going to create jobs. And indeed, with those stimulus funds, Amtrak replaced 1.2 million wooden ties with pre-stressed concrete ties to upgrade their rail bed and lay the foundations. This was not intended to be a one-time show of support. The funding in the stimulus and the funding in the 2010 Fiscal Appropriations Act. President Obama said that $10.5 billion is the beginning. He called it a down payment on a permanent high-speed passenger rail program. And in February, the president proposed an historic investment of $53 billion over the next 6 years to develop high-speed intercity passenger rail, and emphasized the importance of high-speed rail in his State of the Union address to Congress and the American public. He said, we will provide 80% of Americans access to high-speed rail in the next 25 years. It is doable. And that is a welcome change from other administrations that Democratic and Republican, that virtually ignored our dilapidated passenger rail network. And I want you to pay careful attention to these disparities in investment. Over the last 50 years, we've invested, since establishment of the Highway Trust Fund, $1.3 trillion in our highway system. $473 billion in aviation since the establishment in 1970 of the Aviation Trust Fund. But since creation of Amtrak, we've invested $37 billion in passenger rail, a small fraction of what other countries have invested, and a small fraction compared to what we've done in highway and aviation. $1.3 trillion in our federated highway system, $473 billion in aviation, $37 billion for passenger rail. Pitiful. We have to do better. High-speed rail will provide the public with new transportation alternatives, new ways to get from here to there, thousands of jobs that our economy desperately needs. In 2009, when we had the majority and I was chair of the full committee, and Corinne Brown from Jacksonville, Florida, was chair of the rail subcommittee, I called her Madam Amtrak, we held a roundtable with 100 CEOs and representatives from passenger rail industry worldwide, including la SNCF, la Société Nationale des Chemins de Fer, and listen to them, listen to their experiences, listen to how they did it and how they sustained these investments in their countries. In addition, several countries have offered to assist us in developing high-speed rail, and the SNCF is actually under contract with Amtrak to evaluate Amtrak's Northeast Corridor proposal. So with France, Spain, Japan, all underway with development of high-speed passenger rail, expanding their systems, putting substantial investments, I encourage them to work with California, with state of Illinois, with other state and local governments who have seized the moment, taken those high-speed rail funds, and are investing. We cannot fail again. We have to make a serious long-term commitment. But we know that there are challenges. All of you in this room are certainly well aware of the rejection of funds by the state of Wisconsin, Ohio, Florida, despite voter support, despite voter approval. California is way ahead on this scale. Voters have approved a substantial investment over a sustainable period of time to develop intercity high-speed passenger rail. Well, that is an investment that we must continue to make. We have to, for the future of transportation in America. We can no longer choke on our own fumes. And my vision of Armageddon is that moment when we're all choked on our highways, fingers firmly gripped around the steering wheel, and the last drop of gasoline runs through that engine. And we get out, discover our legs, and decide, oh, we made a mistake a long time ago. We must not make that mistake. We are at that moment in history when we can move ahead. And congratulations to California for doing it, and to all of you in this room for committing to high-speed passenger rail. It's a pleasure to be with you. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to respond.
Thank you, Congressman. I think because of time constraints, we have to move to the next panel, but thank you again for your contribution to the conference.
My pleasure.
John, if you want to lead your panel to the panelists. Is your PowerPoint your setup here? I hope so. Oh, okay.
No, I did seem to do
Okay,
so.
good. Well, now it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first panel, the vision of high-speed rail in California, mobility, sustainability, and smart growth. Through this session, we'll review the current state of California high-speed rail project and its role in supporting the state's environmental and economic objectives. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, John Quigley, Donald Turner Distinguished Professor of Economics, Public Policy, and Business, and the Director of the Berkeley Program on Housing and Urban Policy. John?
Thanks. Good morning. Let me give my welcome to all of you to Berkeley as well. It's a beautiful day. It's nice to see you all here discussing the future of high-speed rail in California and throughout the country. I was speaking to someone over the weekend and mentioned this conference this morning, and the person said, well, it's really too bad to have this conference after these decisions were made about continuation in Washington in the past couple of weeks. Won't it be isn't it a letdown? And I was thinking quite the opposite. The notion of this conference at this exact time provides a real opportunity that wasn't available 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago in thinking about high-speed rail. The notion of high-speed rail in California and throughout the country in the U.S. was intimately mixed up in a certain kind of partisan politics and a certain kind of macroeconomic discussion that sort of camouflaged the potential costs and the potential benefits of investment in this kind of system. And that sort of thing is absent now. We now have a little bit of breathing room to think in a sort of serious way about this as an investment project, not as an opportunity to create jobs in the short run, or any of these fixes that were described for or against the wasteful spending. No, it's jobs. Well, it really is an investment in the future. And this is the opportunity to think a little more carefully about the terms of that investment, the advantages to that investment, the costs of that of those investment dollars, and how they can be used, best used, to ensure the future of both the state of California, the west coast of the United States, and the country more generally. As a kickoff panel for this conference, we have an unusually distinguished group of people who can provide some perspective on the transferability of other experiences, potentially to California over the coming generation as it invests in high-speed rail one way or another. The title, the vision of high-speed rail in California really derives in some large part from the experiences in other parts of the world. First, we will have an update on what's going on in high-speed rail in California from the CEO, Ralph Van Ark of the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Then the issue will change slightly to the transferability of the Amtrak experience. What, if anything, can we learn from the triumphs and mistakes of the Northeast Corridor of Amtrak's service and costs that could be used in designing and evaluating high-speed rail in California? We will then, and that will be led by Albrecht Engel, who's the Vice President for High-Speed Rail for Amtrak. Then we will be looking at the transferability of high-speed rail experience, the European perspective, by Fabrice Morel, who's the Director of Rail Team BV in the Netherlands. Again, the question is, what, if anything, can we learn from the successes and the mistakes that have been made in Europe on this? And then finally, cleanup batter will be Betty Deacon, who will put this all into some kind of perspective. Betty's professor of city and regional planning and also of urban design at the University of California. And she will be discussing sustainability and smart growth as it relates to high-speed rail. You will notice that there are these funny little pencils in front of in your tables, and these cards. If something occurs to you, a question, a rude comment, something in which you'd like clarification, don't hesitate to write it down. We'll collect it, we'll pass it through the censor, and we will present it to our panelists at the end of their comments. Each panelist will speak for no more than about 12 minutes. I will watch the time vigilantly so that we'll at least have time for some comments and discussion at the end of the presentations. So without further ado, may I present Ralph Ark, the CEO of California High-Speed Rail Authority.
Is it fine if I stand here? Everything okay? So good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here today at this wonderful institution in Berkeley. I must say, I am the happiest person to be back in California. I did live in California for 6-7 years before, and many people believe I was French somewhere along the line, and many people believed I was German somewhere along the line. But in fact, from my accent, you'll hear I'm actually South African born, Dutch ancestors, so we spoke Nederlands at home. And I am neither French nor German, but I did have some association with some of these companies in the past. It's my pleasure to, as I say, be back here with you to speak about the status of the California High-Speed Rail project. Congressman Oberstar, who was so passionate during his time as the chair of the Transportation Subcommittee, already has told you so much in the introduction about high-speed rail. So I'm sure there will be some repetition as I move through my slides. Firstly, high-speed rail around the world. As you heard from Congressman Oberstar, we are so far behind the rest of the world. Professor Quigley already mentioned, it is not about jobs only today. It is really about our country, this state needs to catch up with the rest of the world, because economically, we've got to stay abreast with the rest. We've got to be able to put that backbone infrastructure in place in our country so that we can compete with our worldwide competitors. And that means we need this alternate way of transportation. We cannot afford, as the population grows, to be sitting in gridlock and not move our people and not be as economically viable as the competitors around the world. It is for that reason that it is so important to put high-speed rail, as the people of California have voted, into our state here in California. So we have cooperation agreements, just by the way, with 8 countries in the world. We have them with the countries you heard earlier on, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Japan, China, Korea. And by the way, you'll hear next week, signing up some more, because there is an interest on the side of the people that have that experience to share that experience with us. And there's a huge need from our side to be able to have access to that experience that these people have gained, many of them in 30, 40 years operating high-speed rail around the world. So we are very happy to be able to have access to that experience around the world. And as I was involved in quite a few of these projects around the world, I made sure that we use these sources that we've got, the access to those people, to make sure that we do not make the mistakes in California that to try and reinvent the wheel all the time. We have to learn, we have to work together with those colleagues that have done it before in the rest of the world. But now about California itself. I want to give you a bit of an update. Many of you must probably know about this project, maybe know more than I do, but I do want to give you a bit of an update on the project and then move into some sustainability areas as well. The project is about an 800-mile project, of which the first section is around about 500 miles between San Francisco and LA, Anaheim. Let us not forget that it is important to connect this Bay Area with the LA Basin. It is important to connect San Francisco with Los Angeles, Anaheim. And why? Because high-speed rail is about connecting over long distances at very high speed people. That is the business model. And if any one of those three things are missing, there is no business case. Because you have to put an infrastructure in place which allows very high-speed operation. That means a very dedicated infrastructure. And you need to connect population centers so that you can move the people long distances at very high speeds, and you need the people connection. So you need to get into those cities. I know there's a bit of a pushback in some areas as to whether we should or shouldn't be getting into these cities. We do need to get into the cities because a high-speed rail without people is not worth building. So we need to get to those people. We operate and intend to operate at a speed of 220 miles per hour. That equates to 350 kilometers an hour. There was, until recently, one country in the world that was operating at 350 kilometers an hour, and that was China. And unfortunately, but maybe correctly so, they made a decision about 2 weeks ago to reduce the speed back down a bit because they had also very aggressively increased the speed beyond that which was used anywhere else in the world. So for that reason, the new Minister of Transportation has been a little bit more conservative and has brought the speed back down to the speeds that you have got in the rest of the world, around 300 kilometers an hour. But the world is planning for 350 kilometers per hour and even a little bit beyond that. So by the time we run our first rail here in California, that will be the best in class. That will be the speed that everybody's going to be operating at. That is the speed we should be aiming at, because it is all about offering a competitive, alternate transportation mode. Our competition is the airlines. Our competition is the motor car. And again, it's not a competition in a negative fashion. It is a competition in a positive fashion. We have to be able to find alternate solutions to moving this constantly growing population we've got here in California up and down our state. We will be operating, as you know, at 100% clean energy, electric power. This is a very safe, reliable way and punctual way of transporting people. And of course, it is all about multimodal transportation. Again, I'm the last person that's going to say that you'll see the last airplane flying from California when we install high-speed rail. It's not that. It's balancing the modes. But we also have to have multimodal centers. We have to have the access to our system by other modes of transportation, including, hopefully, mass transit systems, light rail systems, metro systems, and bicycles and everything else that we can obviously include in the complete business case. It's about the environment. It is an increase in the transportation of our state with a very good effect on air pollution. Decreased consumption of fossil fuels, and that's been in discussion a lot, in particular as the gas price continuously increases, we start feeling it in our pockets. And of course, every high-speed rail system, you heard a bit about it from Congressman Oberstar, is a fantastic anti-sprawl mechanism. People like to be closer to, people like to orientate themselves around stations, closer to stations, access to stations. And in all the examples we've got in the world, you find people migrating and you get an anti-sprawl dimension coming into the planning as well. Under the point mobility here is exactly what you heard from Professor Quigley, and that is everybody agrees that economic power comes from systems of this type. This will give California, not me, not people of my generation, but you, the younger people in the audience, and my children and my grandchildren, that benefit, that economic benefit in the longer term that will make California a better place and a more competitive place to be living in and to be working in. It will obviously, the other aspect, I have to say it, help the economy today, which is an added benefit. If anything, we don't feel it as much where we are here, but just go into our Central Valley and find out how high the unemployment is and how badly these people are hurting and what type of problems they've got there. Any infrastructure project from my days when I did my MBA, is an investment into the future, is an investment into jobs, is an investment into bringing up the economy of a country. If they are local jobs, they're going to be local jobs because it's an infrastructure project. So in California, with the population growing from 38 to 50 million by 2035, and these are not my figures, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we going to build more freeways? Are we going to build more runways and airport gates? Or are we going to put money into an alternate solution? I know many people pop up and say, do we have the money for the system? That's not the question. The question is, in which system are we going to be investing? Are we going to build more freeways? Are we going to build more airports? Or are we going to build an alternate solution, which could be high-speed rail? I just want to show you these, and this is not science. These are just examples. These are, the red bubbles are population centers. And the reason I show you the first one here is because people sometimes feel that, the population densities, and there are differences, don't get me wrong, between what you see in Europe and what you see here in the United States are so different. This little sketch is approximately to scale. That means from left to right, distances are approximately to scale. If you look, the top one, Paris is about a 10 million population center with various stations around the periphery of the city. And the station that is the beginning of the black line is Gare Lyon. And you can see that the first line in France went, in fact, to this little town here called Lyon. Today, Lyon is a city of 1.4 million. I believe at the time when the first line in France was built from here to here, Lyon was a city of about under 1 million, and it was not very well or economically viable. Today, Lyon is a very vibrant city, and I know that the mayor of Lyon over the years was very vocal on the benefits they received by what they did, by getting a high-speed rail station in Lyon. And you can see the population compared to what we are aiming to do, connecting greater LA metropolitan area to the San Francisco Bay Area, where greater LA has got about 19 million people, and San Francisco has got 6.4 million. And we have some smaller cities in between in the 500,000 to 1 million population. And again, this is not the only thing that you work on. It's just to give you a little bit different perspective. People, especially people in the United States, always believe that those high-speed rail systems in Europe are feasible because the population is so great there and the population densities are so great. And in fact, if you look, they carried on from Lyon to Marseille at the end there, another little city of 1.4 million. And that line is also very, very successful. In fact, you know that the French system grew and grew. In fact, I've got a picture like this also for Spain and a few other countries. The Spanish Madrid-Seville was also very similar to this, smaller population, smaller than what most people believe. Everybody believes there the cities are all 10 million and they're all closer together and things like that. They're not. The one that is often looked at is the one in Japan. And this one, people confuse themselves to. And by the way, sorry, if I may, just look, 31 million travelers on this particular line in 2008. We're looking at 39 million riders on our phase one between LA and San Francisco. This one is Japan. And here, yes, the population densities are surely higher. But you can see that between Tokyo and Kyoto, Osaka, Kobe, where there's 34 million on the left and 17 million on the right, high populations. But they have 151 million Shinkansen, very high-speed travelers. But they have 1.7 billion conventional riders every year. So those are huge numbers. The blue boxes here, you can see the blue boxes, those are conventional trains. Because the distances are not all that high here, that's where commuter rail, conventional rail systems, is the solution. High-speed rail, as I mentioned before, is for long distances, high-speed interconnectivity. So once again, people get confused sometimes and think that the United States is just not the right place to put high-speed rail. The United States has got fantastic corridors like the one between San Francisco and Los Angeles for high-speed rail. With us, it is about sustainability. We have sustainability growth and goals. We have, this is just an example here. We're a member of the EPA's Collaborative for Sustainable Transportation Infrastructure Construction. We will ensure that the construction is done according to these guidelines. That means maximized use of recycled low-energy materials, implementation of waste management plans, maximum waste segregation on sites and reduction of landfills, LEED building certification and designs. So we are going to be maximizing wherever we can the positive side of this project on the environment, or minimizing the negative side of this project on the environment. The other thing is our board policy has a goal to ensure 100% renewable energy for this electrically operated rail system. That does not mean that we are intending to get into the power generation business, but we will commit ourselves through the power generation companies, power utilities, to ensure that they build renewable energy systems from which we will source our energy. On the sustainability side, station area development, of course, is a fantastic opportunity as well. This, a high-speed rail area, a station area, is a magnet for opportunity. It is a transformation engine, and it is here that we will ensure that we have sensitive station design and TOD design to solve everything for the pedestrian in the minimum possible space, but with the maximum possible benefit to the environment and to the people in the area. Balancing all the various modes in multimodal hubs. And also, as I did mention to you before, let me get to one example of a little city in Japan, Kakagawa. Kakagawa was a city in Japan that was running out of steam. It had very little tax income. The people, the population there was aging. They were all basically people in retirement. They didn't have high incomes. And the town was really dying out until they were offered the opportunity to get a high-speed rail station. They grabbed the opportunity, invested $150 million equivalent of $150 million, in the development of that station area, TOD area, and now is a vibrant city with a lot of young people, well, a lot of people that are now able to commute between the city of Kakagawa and Tokyo and be able to get themselves in and out, in particular professionals, because professionals need that access to transportation to get to places in the world or in their country and to be mobile. So that was a great example of how you can develop a city just around the fact that you get a high-speed rail station. Just a few words on where we are today. You know that we are intending, and I want to give you one slide on that as well, to start our line, to build our line in the Central Valley, to start building the line in the Central Valley. And then I'll tell you also why. We are still in the NEPA-CEQA clarification phase. We intend for those first two sections in the Central Valley to have our EIR documents launched by the middle of this year, the draft documents, then get public comment to these documents, and then to be able to get our approvals, our ROD nods, by the beginning of 2012. By the end of this year, we intend to go out on RFPs, so request for proposals, for that first construction, and then be in a first construction the second half of 2012. We have today about $6 billion or just under $6 billion for the initial construction. That is made up of about $3.7 billion from the federal government. And by the way, add $400 million to that, because $400 million went in the Transbay Terminal. You know that underneath the Transbay Terminal, they're putting the end station for high-speed rail. That is being directed from the FRA directly to Transbay Terminal. So in fact, we as Californians got $4.1 billion from the federal government already. We need a lot more. I've never said, since I've been around the last 10 months, that we do not need a lot of federal funds. You heard the congressman speaking about it. He was a staunch supporter. He tried to, many times, get a bill in Washington for about $50 billion. You know, the president has now put forward this $53 billion budget over a period of 6 years. This is the type of money you need. There's no question about it anywhere in the world. These projects are public, can be public-private partnerships, but the public portion is very important. Without that public money, these projects will not happen. So the fact that the president has put forward a budget of $53 billion over 6 years, and we all know it will be a bit of a battle for him under the present circumstances in Washington, but we do hope that he's going to be able to retain quite a bit of that, because high-speed rail systems are about building that backbone, that long-distance, very high-quality infrastructure. And if you cannot do it over long distances, you never, ever will build high-speed rail. We can upgrade all kinds of lines in the country, but if you start talking about a real high-speed rail system, it is all about having that long-term vision and that staying power to make it happen. And we need politicians, we need people with long-term vision. Otherwise, we should close our doors, and once again, just tell the rest of the world we don't have the guts to build high-speed rail in our country. I think the time has come for us to move ahead. The other thing is, on the funding side, we have to attract private investors. So it will be PPP, but the private investors will only come when the public shows, in other words, when the government shows that they are committed to building these systems. You will only get private investors. Any of you who are involved in any business will know you'll only get private investors when you can see a revenue stream in the future, when you know there's a secured revenue stream that's going to come in. Private investors are only interested in a revenue stream that will come. We will only get a revenue stream when we get a system that connects people over long distances at high speed. And that means we need to get the public, the government, to put their money in the right place, and then we will get the private investors, as is happening every day overseas. The line in south of Holland, which I worked on, was one of them where there was investment. The operators in Japan are all private operators. Virgin Rail in the UK are private operators. NTV in Italy is a private operator with own investments in trains, so there are possibilities there. We are starting in the Central Valley because that is the backbone of the system. You cannot travel 1 mile in the Central Valley without building new infrastructure. You have to be able to travel at 220 miles an hour. You cannot do that on the existing BNSF track, and you cannot do that on the UP tracks either. That's where we will start, and then we will connect the north and the south of California, connect our 6.4 million people in the north with the 19 million people in the south through the Central Valley, which in itself has got 4.2 million people in the Central Valley, at high speeds and long distances. It is all about that vision, and we must remember that vision as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Van Ark. Our second speaker is Ulrich Engel, who will discuss the transferability, or what can we learn from the Northeast Corridor that's relevant to high-speed rail in California. He's Vice President for High-Speed Rail at Amtrak. If you have these cards, just show them up and we will collect them during the talk. Sir.
Good morning. You can just call me Al. That's what my mother called me, Albrecht. I'm pleased to have been invited and honored to serve in this capacity. I've had the pleasure of actually being involved in the California project for a decade in various consulting capacities, so I feel somewhat of an ownership, and I see Dan out there and a few other familiar faces, and certainly wish this project well. What I'll talk about today, since this is a diversified audience, just give you a little background on Amtrak and the California Amtrak situation, and then tell you about the Northeast Corridor and what we might learn from that experience. Chairman Oberstar certainly has done a great job of setting the context in terms of where we are internationally and what's happening policy-wise in the U.S., so I don't have to do any of that, and Roloff built on that. So let me move right into Amtrak. Some of you who aren't familiar with Amtrak would be surprised to learn that this is a private corporation. It's a for-profit corporation incorporated in D.C., and actually today I'm missing a lot of pomp and circumstance in Washington, D.C., because we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the establishment of Amtrak. There's a historic museum train that will eventually come your way, which is a 3-car train that has all kinds of memorabilia and information on it. So Amtrak has about 20,000 employees, and we operate a 21-mile system, and California is the second largest market for Amtrak. So this is a very important market, and I'm here with Patrick Merrill, who's sitting back there, who runs the West Coast, if you want to get more details on our Amtrak situation here. Chairman Oberstar mentioned the Acela Express. I will talk about that a little bit. It is the only high-speed rail system in the country, the fastest train in the Western Hemisphere. We operate the Northeast Corridor services, which a lot of Californians don't really know about. They know us more about the services we provide here and also the long-distance trains that originate or terminate here. So we operate short corridors under contract or state partnerships, and then the long-distance trains if you want to go across the country to do that. In California here, we have these state partnerships, the Capital Corridor, the Pacific Surfliner, and the San Joaquin service. And we actually run a lot of bus service under our brand through various contractors. The Surfliner is so popular that it actually during the summer carries more than we do on the Acela service in the Northeast. Here's some more detail on the ridership. You can see the Pacific Surfliner is 2.6 million ridership, and Capital Corridor is 1.6, and San Joaquin is about 1 million. And you can get copies of this. I won't read all this. There's an Acela JPEG thing. I don't know what that means. Anyway, ignore that. So it is an extensive system, and I think it's important to remember that all the successful high-speed rail services around the world were created by an operating railroad company that built upon an existing ridership, and of course created a new passenger service or a new transportation service, the TGV or the bullet train, but basically built upon an existing successful service. So I think that's a very fortunate asset that California has. You have an existing service, you have 11 million riders here that already are accustomed and depend on passenger rail service, not at 220 miles an hour, but there's quite a few people. We move already by rail, and that's a great asset to build upon. Many stations that we operate here, and you can see a total of 11 million people in terms of boardings and alighting. So that's a very good base. As far as Amtrak is concerned, we're interested in continuing to move forward in the Northeast Corridor to the next generation of high-speed rail. I'll talk about that for a few minutes. And we're also interested in greenfield projects, working in partnership with California. The Midwest is another opportunity where we're providing a lot of service already and can build upon a base of ridership. And the one corridor that's being upgraded, 210 there, is Chicago to St. Louis. We're in partnership there, and there are a couple of proposals for 220-mile corridors. In the Northeast, Amtrak published its vision for high-speed rail last September, and that's when I came on board. And if you haven't had a chance to get a copy of this, I brought a few copies with me. If you want it, you can see me, and it's also available on our public website. But basically, we arrived at the conclusion in the spring of 2010 that the existing Northeast Corridor will run out of capacity in terms of the demand by 2030, and the way things are going, it may be a lot sooner than that. The corridor is a very complex railroad operation. We operate 2,300 trains per day, and it still includes freights. They retain rights to operate on the corridor, access ports, which was part of the Amtrak deal, the creation of the National Passenger Rail Corporation. As someone pointed out, I think Chairman Oberstar, we do operate at 135 miles an hour south of New York and 150 north. And, but we're operating with a very dated infrastructure, and as you know, the railroads of the past were not built in straight lines. They were built basically at level along water routes. But since we've taken over the corridor in the last 40 years, we've done quite a bit to improve service. The ridership has grown tremendously, as you can see here. Passenger miles have gone up to 1.7 billion. We electrified the north end from New Haven to Boston back in the late 90s, and the whole railroad is now a concrete tie railroad, and it's electrified from Boston to Washington, D.C. On the south end, we're operating on a catenary that is 75 years or more old, so that's a big challenge and restricts our speed to 135. We actually have track that's capable of higher speeds. As I mentioned, for those of you that are not railroaders, the older lines sort of follow the water routes because it kept the railroad fairly level, and also it would certainly reduce construction costs. For high speed, of course, we want to cut through mountains and go over valleys and whatnot, but that is an extensive cost. But that's what we're faced with here in the Northeast Corridor. We have a line from New York to Boston It basically makes 12.5 circles if you add up all the curves from New York to Boston. So the best we can do on that line is about 3.5 hours. We do have that section in Rhode Island that we can run at 150. And on the south end, we're fortunate that the railroad did sort of follow the water level more closely, and it happened to be straight in many places. So on the south end, we can build a high-speed line, and the vision is a 220-mile-an-hour line from Boston to New York. These are just alignments that were used for the conceptual engineering study. The north end and the top here is overland through Hartford, and on the south end, we follow the existing right-of-way. And the dramatic trip times improvement was an hour and 36 minutes from New York to D.C. and under an hour and a half from New York to Boston. And of course, with a brand new 2-track, 220-mile-an-hour railroad, we could operate many trains. The initial ridership would justify 4 trains per hour and leave a lot of capacity for growth. We developed a comprehensive service plan that would give every town, every city along the way service at least once an hour in the more populous centers. I have another chart I didn't put in here, but if you compare this corridor with the Tokyo to Osaka corridor, this is even more promising in terms of population centers and densities. So it's a fully justified investment, and we did do a benefit cost assessment I'll show you in a minute. The ridership was projected to go to 34 million from 12 million today and 38 million. And the premium ridership here on the right is in the yellow color. And of course, that allows you to charge a pretty good fare. So the revenue projection was quite impressive, and over 2.5 billion in revenues with an operating surplus of over 900 million. So part of this investment can be financed with long-term debt. Right now, we have an RFP on the street for a business plan and financing study where we're going to engage the best in the world in terms of identifying all the privatization opportunities within this corridor. But in the first cut here in the conceptual study, these are the job opportunities that are created during construction, 44,000 full-time jobs per year for 25 years. I don't know how many that, you can run the numbers and see what the total man-year jobs are. It would leave 120,000 permanent jobs, and 7,000 would be rail jobs. The cost is substantial, and we've given this out for peer review to about 16 international companies. We've gotten quite a bit of feedback. The SNCF gave us a very extensive report. J.R. East is visiting with us in a few days to give us their complete report, and Renfe, all the international high-speed rail operators. I haven't seen a report from China yet. But we are having this evaluated by everyone, and we've gotten some great feedback. One feedback was, it's too much money. Well, if we could find a way to reduce the cost, that would be wonderful. 117 billion, it's not a lowball number. It's a number that was developed through a very thorough engineering analysis. But even at that cost, and hopefully we can find ways to improve on that, the benefit-cost ratio, when you add up all the benefits here on the right tabulation, is 2.3 times the cost. So it's really a very sensible public investment. And again, we're looking for maximum private participation. What we're doing, as we have been building the service over the years, and I don't have time to get through it, we have continued to put more service out in front of the customer. The demand is tremendous. All the people who are involved with 12 states on this corridor, they have voted by purchasing tickets on the Acela. Many Acelas are sold out, and we are going to increase the Acela capacity, which is the high-speed service, 40% by lengthening the trains in about 3-4 years. We're buying a second fleet to double the frequency, and we're also upgrading the south end to achieve 160 miles an hour. So as we wait for next generation high-speed rail, which will not come until the mid-1920s, we are improving the system along the way. The first major capital program, which is under design right now, is 2 new tracks into the city of New York under the Hudson River, and 2 new tracks from New York to Newark. And there's a brand new gateway into the intercity service, the Moynihan Station, named after the late Senator Moynihan in New York. It's actually using the Farley post office. And the first operable segment, is there anyone here from the FRA? Okay, I was told I can't use first operable segment because we're doing all these improvements with normal EISs, and then there's a programmatic that's going on, which I could talk about for a while, but I won't, that will study the whole corridor. So we expect to have the first dedicated high-speed line operational in about 11 years between New York and Philadelphia, and that'll be the launch of a 220-mile-an-hour service south to Washington, D.C. So this is the incremental improvements. I won't read through all that because we're running out of time. So the existing system does serve as a foundation for development, terminal facilities, the suitable segments to be upgraded and whatnot. Most foreign systems, as I said earlier, have developed in an incremental fashion. And I think there's a lot that we can learn in California by working with, you're working with international operators and certainly building upon the Amtrak presence here and expanding that passenger rail service. Amtrak is certainly ready to work with California to transfer that knowledge and work in the evolution of this system. These projects are enormous undertakings, and you got to put together the right team, which we certainly are doing for New York and other projects. As Roloff said, connectivity is vital. One of the flaws in the Florida system was it really didn't have any distribution systems at the end. So who wants to rent a car to get to the railroad and then rent a car at the other end? In California, over the last 30 years, you've built a lot of distribution systems in the LA area, and certainly San Francisco has always had a rich public transit system. So the connectivity with the other modes, not only the public transportation, but the airport. If I had more time, I would show you all the connectivity that we have in the high-speed rail vision, which is with the automobile mode, with the airport mode, et cetera. But I'm out of time, so you can ask me about that. So anyway, thank you for your attention. I hope that's worthwhile in terms of giving you a feel for how high-speed rail is evolving in the Northeast and how we might transfer some of that expertise to California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. Our third speaker will discuss a European perspective on high-speed rail and sustainable development, Fabrice Morel from Rail Team BB. Perfect, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you to UC Berkeley and to Blas in particular for having me today. I realize I'm the European representative today. I think I'm going to be expected to make that quick. The program says that I'm based in Amsterdam, but as you can hear, I'm actually French. And I'm French, but as you might hear from my accent, I've also spent quite a bit of time in New York, where I was the CEO of, lastly, I was the CEO of Rail Europe, which is a distributor of European train tickets and rail passes to American travel agents and consumers. And as the head of Rail Europe, I was able to discover the depth of the US traveler and travel agents' ignorance about European geography and European trains. And I am here to tell you today that Europeans themselves are no better, at least when it comes to intra-European mobility between European countries. The Europeans are fairly familiar with their own domestic systems and with a couple of highly publicized international direct lines that we've spoken about. But when it comes to venturing beyond those quite familiar city pairs, the knowledge drops drastically. In 2020, it's expected that about half of the current top air routes in Europe will be better served faster by high-speed rail. However, on the perimeter that is covered by the Rail Team Alliance, which I will detail in a few minutes, about just below 85% of all trips are currently still made by road or by air. High-speed rail only has a 5.5% roughly percent market share. However, of those 85% travelers not traveling by rail, about 10% state spontaneously that they would really rather be doing it by train if given the option, and the option exists, but they're just not taking advantage of it. Because, as you can see, only 1 out of 5 intra-European air traveler going from one country to another even considers the train before booking their flights. So just as in the US, the mode of taking the plane for traveling internationally, or alternatively using the car, even though we know about all the obstacles to car usage that exists in Europe versus the US, even though we have those advantages, we still do not have, by any means, a sort of top-of-mind situation amongst the behavior of the European traveler. And one of the key reasons for that is that all other things being equal in terms of elapsed time from city center to city center, as soon as we offer a trip involving a connection, the railway's market share is divided by 3 versus a direct connection against air and road. Even if the connection involves just crossing a platform, as is more and more often the case in European rail travel. Finally, and this is really the one that always floors me, more than 40% of European travelers, and this is a survey that we commissioned, so we were obviously expecting better news than that. More than 40% European travelers actually consider air or car as a more punctual way of traveling than high-speed rail, which, when you consider the level of congestion of European roads or of European skies, especially since deregulation, it is a mind-boggling statement. To address those persistent deficiencies in the consumer's perception, in the traveler's perception, several European railways have teamed up in creating Rail Team, a one-of-a-kind alliance between operators. This is a carriers alliance, so I'm not going to talk about, as many of my fellow panelists or future speakers today are going to talk a lot about infrastructure. This is not really our focus. We are focused on running trains on existing infrastructure. Rail Team is about 4 years old. The membership is the 2 big heavyweights in the European rail scene, Deutsche Bahn and the French Railways, SNCF, and we have 5 other partners, the railways of Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, Netherlands, and Eurostar, the Channel Tunnel operator between Belgium and France and London. I realize that the picture here is showing mostly tall white guys, which is not exactly the picture of diversity that we'd like to show. The current board of directors has 6 women out of 14, and the members represent about 500,000, a workforce of 500,000, which has a lot of diversity in it. So this is not necessarily if you consider diversity to be a part of sustainability, which I think we should, this is not necessarily the most accurate picture. We created a jointly financed legal entity that's headquartered in the Netherlands, hence my being based in Amsterdam, and we always have 2 co-directors, always one that comes from SNCF, and always one that comes from DB, in a what you would call here a bipartisan spirit, to ensure that the decisions are taken in the most neutral way to the advantage of all of the members. What are we trying to do? We are really trying to focus on the European traveler and customer. We want to reveal the fact that there is a true European high-speed network, and not just a juxtaposition of operators and high-speed line. We want, once the customers know about this, we want to facilitate access to that, to those offers and services on that network, and then we want to make the experience a better one than it actually is. We don't do anything under our own name. We're only here to facilitate the railways improving their own services. We're acting as we're egging them on, if you will. We're trying to spur them into making making improvements. And I also want to state that we are not, by any stretch of the imagination, a cartel or an entente between carriers. We're not into price setting or restraining capacity or any of those things. We are totally competition compatible, and in fact, we are an open alliance who welcomes anyone who wants to join us. And also, we already have, and we will have in increasing numbers, competition between the members on some of the airlines, on some of the lines that we have on offer. If I want you to remember one thing from this presentation, it would be that map. It's a map of the European rail network, but instead of showing, as it normally does, a juxtaposition of several lines of a different color depending on who operates them and in which country they are, this is looking like a subway map at the level of Europe, and we really have designed it that way. We want the customer to have a perception of a completely seamless service across the 11,000 miles of line that the network covers. So there are conventional lines on this one, but there are also about more than a quarter of those lines, 3,500 miles, are high speed. And it's a number that's going to continue to grow because there are several hundreds of miles that are still under construction on this network. We represent 7 different high-speed rail services, some very, very famous names like TGV or Eurostar, some others that may be a little more publicized among the customer, Railjet in Austria, the FIRA service on the new Dutch high-speed line. We organized around hubs or connection stations like we have like you have on a subway map or on an airline route system, where rail team services connect and interchange. But we cover almost 800 city pairs, and also want to state that we have probably on any given day we have more than 1,000 high-speed train sets in operation across the whole network. So it's a huge network. As a result, in 2007, this system was carrying 44 million, was making 44 million trips per year on the network. We're probably now somewhere between 50 and probably somewhere around 55 million at this time, based on the best estimates we have. How do we operate? We are totally customer-oriented, as I mentioned. We measure the expectations of our customers. What do they want? There may be a lesson here for anyone who wants to develop a high-speed services. They want simple and transparent fares, more transparent because today the fare structure varies from one operator to another. The philosophy of high-speed rail and high-speed rail distribution in Germany is completely different from the one in France, for example. So we have to reconcile those when it comes to international travel. They want shorter connections and better assistance while they're making those connections. They want information, very important, along the entire duration of their trip and at any time before, during, and after their trip in real time. This is a key area of work for us because the European domestic systems have been developed separately and with a domestic focus, and they don't necessarily talk to one another so well at this stage. So we're trying to create bridges between them. They want their loyalty to an operator or to a series of, or to an alliance of operators to be recognized. So they expect their loyalty to be rewarded, and they want as many destination and frequencies available as long as it is sustainable. They do state in surveys that sustainability is, at least a half of the customers state in surveys that sustainability is an important factor for them in making their decision. Once those needs have been ascertained, we discuss between members in work groups made of experts of each member under the direction of Rail Team, and we develop corresponding standards in all of the areas of the travel experience that the members then implement jointly under the authority of under the direct supervision of the CEOs of the passenger division of each alliance. This is a very important point because sometimes the needs of the international traveler are secondary compared to the bulk of the travelers which are still domestic on those in European countries. So for example, when you want to launch at SNCF a huge program whereby you're going to train all of the train conductors to speak English, because breaking news, not everyone at the French railroads speaks English like I do. It takes quite a bit of effort and leverage from the CEO to make those things happen. And it's important to know that this effort is going to be replicated by the other railways that are part of the alliance. And we measure this, the compliance of the members to the standards through mystery traveler audits. An example to the right of standards we do, we've established a program of managing disruptions in travel and making sure that customers can be replaced on another train when they miss their incoming rail team train at a connection, which used to be a huge issue. It's something that the airlines do as a matter of course. It's something that the European rail operators are just coming to putting together. This has been a huge breakthrough for us. Other things we do, we provide a lot in terms of the informational scene, harmonization of the schedule, of the display of schedules, real-time information exchange, I spoke about that, available on websites, on mobile applications. Mobile applications and the website also feature what we call the Echo Passenger tool, which enables you to compare for a given itinerary your emissions depending on which mode of transportation you are using. I spoke about the English multilingual information on board standard that we've put together. We've also worked on improving, especially in those 5 hub stations that I identified, the level of information that we make available, the signage, so that people can find their way from one station to another, because once you're outside of your the main station that you're familiar with, it can become quite different. Europe is a very diverse area, and there's not much in common between the layout of a station in France and one in say in Belgium or in Germany, for example. And we've also improved the accrual possibilities and the redemption under the loyalty programs. In terms of sustainability, how does that translate? We identified 3 facets to sustainability. The first one is the contribution to what we call smart growth. This is mostly something that comes before we come in play. Europe is an integrated market. It needs, as its backbone, a network of international network of high-speed line being laid out. But I want to point out, and it will be pointed out by other speakers during this conference, that the powerful tool of local regeneration that, including for some hub cities of rail team like Lille, that being at a crossroads of high-speed stations has been. Eco-mobility, very important features of all we do, of course. By far, high-speed rail has the lowest carbon footprint of all the transportation modes that it competes with, between 60 and 90% of lower emissions compared to air or road, depending, of course, on the load factor of the trains. And by virtue of what we are doing to push international travelers, we are contributing to improving those load factors without putting more trains or more infrastructure on the ground. We are very big on intermodality. This was also mentioned by previous speakers. The rail team hubs are fully connected to the local transportation networks, all the way to bicycles in some and bicycle rental possibilities in some countries. We do sell on certain of our trains. We've made it a standard to sell train tickets. Subway tickets or bus tickets for local transportation, so that people don't have to wait in line once they arrive at the station. Our members have also developed offers that enable you to further your international travel, to local travel, to go to any station still with your international ticket. This is particularly big in Belgium or in Switzerland. And also, as was already indicated, the standards that we have in terms of service on board of our trains are very big in improving the passenger well-being, which is also a key component of sustainability. Time savings while on board and reduced stress, increased productivity or better sleep while on board of a train. Safety and affordability and accessibility, also important dimensions. To close, just want to also tell you that we are working towards the long term. We have commissioned a study called Network 2020, where we are trying to imagine what the European network would be if international high speed was given a priority over all other domestic or freight transportation modes. And we estimate that from a baseline in 2020 of 67 million likely passengers on the network per year, trips per year, we could go optimize this and give it another 7 million travelers, or a 0.5 market share through better coordination of our services, minute adjustments on schedule or on frequencies, improved slight changes in the hubs, building a passageway here or there, or moving trains, enlarging a platform or another. And I'm going to spare you the computation at the bottom, but you will see that we can generate a savings of, in terms of CO2 emissions, of more than 170 million tons. And now I'm realized that I have not cared to convert this into from the metric systems. So that would probably be 173 kilos would translate into about 400 pounds. So you make the computation. Sorry about that part. So to conclude, I will say that we have a bit the opposite problem that you have. We're not trying to build something from scratch. We are trying to create some consistency into a juxtaposition and abundance of existing systems that don't talk to one another. But I hope that there are still, in the priorities that we've set out, that you can still see what valuable things can be done and what factors need to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our fourth speaker is Elizabeth Deacon, who's professor of city planning here at Berkeley. Until recently, she was the director of the Institute for Transportation Studies at the University of California, and was co-director of the Metropolitan Studies Institute here on the Berkeley campus.
Good morning. I think I'm the diversity on this panel in many ways. We just heard about the California high-speed rail proposal, and I'm going to use that as the basis of my examples today as I talk about environmental impact in transportation. And I'm going to define environmental impact rather broadly to include both natural environmental impacts, but also urban environmental impacts, which I think are really a critical issue here in California and probably the key issue in our sustainability efforts. Environmental impacts of high-speed rail present both problems and great potential in my assessment. We are undergoing a lengthy environmental process with several rounds of environmental review. We've done system-wide reviews. We're now doing segment reviews, project-by-project reviews that will really let us drill down and identify environmental problems. And for those of you who aren't Californians, under California law, we are also required to mitigate environmental impacts, so there will be responsibilities to try to reduce those impacts to a minimal level. Clearly, in any kind of major construction project like high-speed rail, but for that matter, highways or airports would have the same kinds of issues. There will be temporary construction-related impacts. There will be unavoidable negative impacts on the natural and built environment. But I think there also are potential for high-speed rail to be an environmental asset. And the environmental review will continue segment by segment, looking at the details, including the mitigation reduction, so to try to minimize the negative impacts and maximize the potential for really achieving some environmental benefits. I took this from the California High-Speed Rail Authority's vision statement from a little bit ago, looking at some of the things that really focus on their view of what might be the environmental benefits. One is, and they're circled here in red, one is congestion relief at freeways and airports. In other words, if you can attract away people from those modes of transport, there will be a lower impact from those modes of transport, one of which is congestion because we're running out of capacity under existing technologies. Another is improved air quality, improved energy efficiency, reduced dependence on foreign oil, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and you've just heard about that. And then in this final column, which I also include as environmental benefits, revitalized communities with economic development around stations in the form of transit and pedestrian-oriented infill development, which not only would help to feed high-speed rail, but it probably more than it helps feed high-speed rail would help develop the quality of life in these urban places. And so those are some of the environmental impacts. Now, I want to talk about the impacts on the natural environment, agriculture, the built environment, and I also want to list some of the particular concerns that stakeholders have raised about high-speed rail in California, and one of the first ones is noise. There's a concern that it could be more than 90 decibels at high speeds, and also there's visual intrusion from elevated structures in particular, or sound walls that might be put around the stations. And high-speed rail, because it is high-speed, has to be fenced. So you have fencing, and that creates severance problems, access restrictions due to the protection of the right-of-way. There's potential in California that could be serious, which is an impact on farming due to severance and access restrictions. The Central Valley, where high-speed rail will travel, has very large farming areas, and currently has railroads going through them, and of course the existing right-of-way is going to be used, or the train will follow the existing right-of-way where that's feasible. One of the complications is farmers do go across the existing tracks, and they're not going to be able to go across the tracks in the same way as they do now, so there'll be some access restrictions. Potential impacts on parks and recreation areas, and that in large part is an issue here in Northern California, where the decision to go into San Jose through the Pacheco Pass also has some potential for impact on wildlife and on relatively pristine environmental areas. And the adverse effects of noise from the trains on wildlife is an issue, as it is with most other transportation measures. Endangered and threatened species is an issue in California. We have a lot of them, some of them in the Central Valley, and so we have to be thinking about noise barriers and roadkill options. And then, of course, there are public accessibility and the cost and timing that come with this. Now, air quality, greenhouse gas, and energy issues are ones that get listed a lot in researchers. And if you do a scan on where research is going on, you'll find that a huge amount of emphasis is being put on those issues, on air quality and greenhouse gas reductions. But don't appear to be listed at the top for stakeholders. And I think I'm going to show you in a minute that the stakeholders are probably right on this one, that the greenhouse gas and air pollution benefits are important, but relatively small, modest contributions from anything like high-speed rail, and I'll tell you why. First, on some of those temporary impacts that I mentioned, certainly there's going to be disruption of circulation patterns during construction, and that can interfere with both rail and road traffic, and that can have some lasting effects. For those of you who are around, there might be a few people in the room who were around when BART was being built. You'll remember that when BART was being constructed along College Avenue in Oakland, and when the freeway is being constructed along College Avenue in Oakland, there was a lot of disruption. And for many years into the 70s, the businesses along College Avenue largely consisted of used furniture stores and dance studios and other sort of very marginal uses for those offices. You wouldn't recognize the place now, because the economy has since recovered. The BART station and the freeway are assets in those communities that serve those areas. But there was a long period of 20 or 30 years where there was an economic downturn because of the construction effects. So it can be real, and we've seen this before. That's partly due to the disruption that happens. It's partly due to construction, noise, and emissions. You have to worry during construction about runoff and water table impacts. Following best practices, however, is something we know how to do. We've learned a lot over the last 30 years about how to manage these kinds of construction impacts, and we can mostly keep them to manageable levels. In the consideration of the natural environment, we have to worry about waterways, wetlands, and natural preserves, or biologically sensitive habitat areas. Parklands and trails that are being crossed will be disrupted by this kind of thing, and encroachment into areas of highly erodible and otherwise sensitive soils. And once again, there are strategies that can minimize the impact, some of which are kind of expensive. For example, in urban areas, one way of minimizing the impact is to underground the facilities. But undergrounding facilities can cost 5 times as much as building at the surface or at an elevated track. So that can be a huge additional impact to try to mitigate in that fashion. So looking for affordable mitigation, I think, becomes part of the issue. In comparison to other modes is something I think we have to think about. How does high-speed rail compare to auto or air? And one factor here is that both auto and air are going to be improving over time, or at least we expect that they're going to be. So the result is that could reduce the benefits of high-speed rail in comparison to auto or air, because auto and air could be a lot cleaner, a lot more efficient, a lot more effective. So we could talk about congestion in airports if airports continue to operate the way they are now, but if air operations have an order of magnitude improvement, then the ability of high-speed rail to compete won't be quite as easy. Likewise, we could see that those kinds of modes could deteriorate further. For many, many years, we've been talking about the 80-mile-a-gallon car. We've heard that since the first energy crisis in the 1970s. We still don't have 80-mile-an-hour cars driving around as the majority of the fleet. In fact, it took us over 30 years to get to the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel efficiency standards that were enacted during the Jimmy Carter era. Because of various downturns in energy prices, removing the market pull for that, and various political changes, reducing the political push for that. Took us a long time to even get to a standard we thought we could achieve in about 10 years. So we have to be a little careful in assuming that the technological optimism in any of the modes will really be delivered from an environmental perspective. It also depends in part then on both technology and public policy. So how fast vehicle emissions and energy use improves is not just a matter of what we know about technology or what we can develop in technology, but also how we apply that technology through public policy. And again, the example of the automobile is a good one here. With the automobile, what we found was we had a lot of new technology that really gave us better use of energy, and we used it to build muscle cars. And to drive SUVs around. So we didn't actually use it to save energy. We used it to go very fast when we accelerated on the freeway. Overall impact on transportation, on the other hand, is something I have to say is going to be pretty small, at least in the California example, because we're not at the same levels of ridership, and we don't expect to be at the same levels of ridership that we heard about from our European counterparts, or even from our Northeast Corridor counterparts from the Amtrak examples. The ridership at the 80 million level that's being talked about, which is high end of the level for 2030, is actually considerably lower than BART carries now on an annual basis, just BART alone, well below what Muni carries. So just as a comparison of where it stands as a mode of transportation in the state, it's a relatively small mode of transportation. BARTs carry between 320 and 350 riders a day, just to give you a point of comparison. On the other hand, let me show you this map done by our graduate student, John Doyle, of the Diridon station versus the California 87 I-280 interchange. So if you want to look at footprints, as one source of environmental impact, you can see the difference here between the Diridon station, which is a big station for high-speed rail because it has every mode on Earth going into it practically, versus, take a look at that freeway interchange. And that's not even the biggest freeway interchange we have around. So you can see that the environmental impact in terms of footprint is really tiny for high-speed rail compared to that of a freeway. And the rail could carry more passengers, by the way. Now, I mentioned that some of the air pollution and greenhouse gas emission impacts are a source of a lot of research, not necessarily a source of a lot of public clamor for change. This is a piece of work that was done by Lee Shipper, Andy Kaczynski, who I see sitting in the audience here, and myself earlier this year, well, actually last year, and finished up and published this year, on air pollution, greenhouse gas emission impacts for California, looking at how other modes are going to change. You heard earlier that in part this depends on how electricity is generated, and we're hoping to buy clean electricity in California. It also depends on life cycle analysis. If you do a life cycle analysis and look at cradle to grave from the time you put all the construction materials together until you have to retire that system, you get a slightly different analysis. And just as one example, the amount of concrete you use in high-speed rail, if you use concrete for the construction of the right-of-way, it can make a huge difference in how the energy balance comes out. The other modes will be getting cleaner and more energy efficient, but given the small share of travel in the HSR range, the overall contribution is pretty modest, and that's basically what this shows you, that high-speed rail is a pretty small portion. The colors on this didn't come out the way they did on my machine, so it's a little hard to read here, but high-speed rail is a little tiny line there in the overall contribution. Now, I would like to talk more about land use impacts, because here's where I think there's some really interesting possibilities coming along. Clearly, there's some immediate land use impacts that could happen depending on how things are done, both around stations and with the line itself. Often there's some takings of homes and businesses. Those can be full takings. You actually need it to build the station. You need it to build some of the right-of-way. Or it could be a partial taking where you need a piece of it, or where you basically have interventions that reduce the functionality of the particular kind of use that you see. Loss of access to urban and rural parcels, which I mentioned earlier, has land use impacts. Impacts on prime and unique farmland are an issue here. And here's just an example, and this is from Fresno. Fresno is one of the main agricultural counties in Fresno County in the United States. And the pink and red here are unprotected farmlands. Now, why do we care about farmland in the Central Valley? Well, Central Valley produces something like 50% of the fresh fruits and vegetables consumed in the United States. So everybody has a hand in what happens there, has some concern about what happens there. It's not under agricultural protection agreements if it's in red and pink in this map, and you can see that all around the edges of Fresno, there's a lot of land that is not in agricultural protection. But what I mean by that is agricultural protection agreements give the property owner a tax break in return for agreeing to continue to keep the land in current use, in agricultural use. And one of the reasons, of course, that farmers take the land out of current use is they can then look at it as a way of farming houses. That's a way of developing the land over time. And I think one issue is when you see that much land around the urban edge becoming available, and of course this was something that happened largely before the immediate housing downturn that we saw in the last couple of years. A lot of people kind of thinking maybe that's their retirement plan. Maybe that's the way they make a little extra money. Maybe they can borrow a little money to keep the farm going. There's a lot of things going on there. But one question that high-speed rail raises is will further development out into those farmlands. Do people actually think that they could live there, get a relatively inexpensive house, commute to a job in Silicon Valley or in San Francisco, or will it actually help create plans and impetus for more compact growth, which is what we've heard about before, the idea of TOD around the stations. Now, that's a real question, and I'll address that again in a little minute. Let me just show you some of the other impacts that I'd like to talk about. Visual impacts of elevated structures, sound walls and other elements that can affect property values. But there are new opportunities for infill and higher density. Now, here's just an example of what a 60-foot structure would look like if you put it on an elevated track and it goes through low density, 2-3-story, single family kinds of stuff. But you can begin to put infill around that and pull it back into the urban fabric. So it's not as much of an intrusion if you start doing that. There's a lot of infill potential, and again, using Fresno as an example, just looking at the amount of land Fresno has in right-of-way of streets, gigantically wide streets, 34%. Underdeveloped locked areas, not including the parking in the buildings, 43%. Parking area, another 9%. And lots of possibilities of doing the kind of infill that we're showing in this kind of diagram that we worked on with the city of Fresno, where the building here is actually in existence. The next building over is one that we sketched in as an infill development potential that just shows that there are those kinds of opportunities for creating an urban street environment by just filling in skipped over land, lower density development lots. You can then begin to think about how you can connect that kind of high-speed rail station in the downtown, where there's something like 40,000 jobs now, to other job centers, the universities, the Fresno State University, City College, the Pacific University that's out there, several other commercial centers in the area, and to the airport itself, I suppose, which would then begin to give you a network of connections, bringing yourselves into this. So let me just wrap up by saying I think some of the questions are, what environmental costs and benefits will materialize? Many of the environmental costs that I've mentioned, which are the result of construction of the rail lines, land taking, severance, access disruption, or visual impacts, are going to happen if you build something. That's just the nature of building. Some are the result of operating trains, whether or not they attract passengers. If you run an empty train, it's still going to make noise. If you run a full train, it makes noise. So a good part of the energy and emissions consequences. Still others depend on whether ridership materializes and the extent to which it's diverted from other modes. So if you want to talk about the relative savings in air quality or energy or carbon emissions avoidance, or for that matter, urban revitalization during gestation activity, better have riders on those trains. Got to make sure they're really going to be carrying people, because you can get those negative impacts from the empty trains, but you ought to get the positive impacts if you've got people riding on those trains who might otherwise have been traveling by a more environmentally destructive mode. So both public policy and technology advances play important roles in making sure this happens. So let me just sum up by saying some environmental impacts are negative and unavoidable. Some depend on attracting riders from air and auto. The relative impact depends in part on how other modes perform over the next decades, and that's a matter of technology and public policy. And finally, the relative impact also depends on whether cities and counties coordinate their land use strategies with high-speed rail. So that's also a matter of both public policy and markets. Thank you.
Thanks, Betty. I'm sorry we don't have more time for questions. There are a number of very interesting questions here, which I will try to summarize and ask the panelists to respond to, at least in general. And we have more appearing. Thanks. One set of questions has to do with the relationship between these organizations and the larger public. Questions about the extent to which public outreach and education as a process is defined as a part of the high-speed rail enterprise and what role you guys take in it. Question, or described another way, is selling of high-speed rail investment and the extent to which this is part and parcel of activities. And then the kind of related to the whole thing is the fact that the benefits to this are way out in the future, and how do we get the public to focus on the right interest rate, at least the way an economist would think about it, in thinking about the long-run benefits and the short-run costs. So if the panelists would like to respond to this class of questions, please. Mr. Morrow? Yeah, if you'd like.
Well,
I don't mean to put you on the spot. Is there anyone else?
No, it's quite all right. I can give a European perspective again on both items. For the public outreach, we are in a bit of the European railways that are part of the alliance are in a bit of a paradox, because they are all at this stage until new entrants come in the market, which will happen because the European Union and the European Commission wants more competition and open access on the tracks. The existing entities, SNCF, Deutsche Bahn, and the others are all state-owned legacy monopolies with a strong public service ethos. But on the other hand, they are expected to make money They are not subsidized. They're running like commercial like commercial for-profit operations, and they are in this paradox that they have to manage the expectations of customers that say it's a public service, which often is combined with, well, it should be cheap, and then the fact that they have to create a pricing structure that optimizes the average yield and that optimizes the load factor on the existing trains. And so there's a lot of communication effort that goes into selling the notion of the high-speed trains, but also into explaining and educating the public as to why, as incumbent public services, they also have to have a sophisticated pricing structure in place to optimize the public good that is delivered by high speed in terms of improving the load factor. As for the other part of the question, well, then please go, because I don't want to hog the mic.
Well, is this working? Okay. It says 10 inches, but anyway, I'm much closer than that. You just answered the question of why aren't these things privatized? Because the return on the investment is so far out. And it's a public infrastructure project, and you need the public investment on the front end. There are people in the government now that say, why don't you just privatize the Northeast Corridor? And that would be a great thing, but there's no one that will step up and put in tens of billions of dollars in hopes of a return 15 years down the road. It's just like public transit investments, water systems, you name it. It's a public utility, it's a public infrastructure project. But we can find ways to create businesses within the high-speed rail project that private investors can invest in. And that's what we're doing now to define how much of that is real and how much is required in terms of grant money, how much you can long-term finance a portion of it. So I don't know if that answers the question of those that asked that question, but it's very difficult. And there are no examples, really. I think Taiwan is the only example where you had a 5% equity participation up front. But as you go down and you build it, you can have takeout strategies like HS1, where the system, which was generating cash flow and built and successful, the segment between Folkestone and London was sold back to Canadian pension entities, not sold, leased for 30 years. For the cash flow as a long-term investment. I think they got about $2.8 billion for a $6 billion project or something like that. So there are takeout strategies and there are other different contracting out strategies. Now, in terms of the outreach, we're involved in major outreach. There's two kinds of outreach. There's the formal outreach where you do a tier 1 programmatic, which California has been involved in for many, many years, which involves hundreds and hundreds of public meetings to gather all the feedback you can from all the potential stakeholders, from the farmers to the municipal politicians to everybody. That's a very formal process. It's documented, and that information is used to basically describe the project and design it in such a way to minimize the environmental impacts and maximize the benefits. We at Amtrak are also continuously involved in outreach to our ridership and the rest of the community that doesn't necessarily ride but benefits through various means. Just one example is this whole week is National Train Day, and incorporated in that communication effort, and that's a multi-million-dollar communication effort, which brings back tremendous, we can measure the return on that investment in terms of additional ridership, but we have events going on here in Los Angeles, in Chicago, New York, Washington, Philadelphia, Washington, which creates exciting kinds of activity, including rock stars, basically, to bring the public in on rail transportation. And in that process, we're communicating all the high-speed rail initiatives in the Midwest, in the West, and also the Northeast Corridor. Anyway.
Maybe I can make a comment because most of you in California, so you're interested in the Californian perspective as well. As far as outreach is concerned, you mustn't forget that this project has been basically alive for 12, 15 years. And many, many years of outreach has taken place, but many, many people did not believe the project would ever happen. And I remember when I lived back here in California, 10, 12 years ago, I used to go to some of these meetings because I was in the industry. I was not in my position, obviously, that I'm in today. But people did not really go to a lot of the meetings because they didn't believe that the project would ever happen. That's only one of the answers. Of course, as the project has now further developed, we do at least kind of 100 meetings a month, but the project is huge. The project is huge. Up and down California, it touches millions of people. And therefore, the need for outreach will never be enough. There will always be more of a demand for outreach. But a lot is being done to speak to the people in public meetings, in technical meetings, in policy meetings. So we are constantly reaching out to people. And I personally am constantly in forums like this, speaking to people and trying to get the messages out and listening to people. So we will continue doing that. I think you've heard quite a bit on privatization. Yes, as I mentioned in my presentation today, it is very difficult because this is a long-term vision. It's a long-term project. And where the investors must see the revenue stream that's going to come in the longer term, as well as the other benefits. It's not only the financial benefit, it's also the environmental and other benefits that you get, but they will only come in the longer term. So what we need, if we really want to be in the high-speed rail business in the United States of America, is people that can believe in the longer term and can have that longer-term vision. I think there are quite a few people today in politics, and they're going to drive a big part of this, that are willing to understand that this is a long-term vision with a long-term return. It's not something that's going to have the return in the short term. And the investors will come later on, not early on in the process. They talk to us every day.
It's very helpful also to have nonprofit associations involved in the outreach. Back in 2005, I was involved with other people in instigating the creation of an association called the Association for California High-Speed Trains, which got behind the Proposition 1A, and I think had an impact on getting that proposition passed by creating another organization that raised several $1 million for radio spots and all kinds of outreach. On the East Coast, there are a number of organizations. Of course, National Association of Railroad Passengers is very effective. The Regional Plan Association has created this America 2050 group, which has been very helpful in getting the word to the business community. We really need the business community to get behind these projects, and I think they got behind the referendum. But the outreach can take many avenues, and the people that are in the public positions can certainly influence the creation of those kinds of events, but it's a separate entity that can communicate in a different way than a public entity can.
A second set of questions, a large number of questions, have to do with the relationship between the executive in Washington and the execution of high-speed rail in states or in collections of states, or the analogous leadership question in European and other rail systems. How important is the attitude of leadership, not exclusively the financial aspects of executive leadership, in driving the high-speed rail systems and in providing the kinds of support that's necessary politically in order to have high-speed rail materialize? Anyone like to comment on any of those aspects?
Obviously, we have our two tiers of government. So we have our state and we have our federal government. But it is extremely important for us to have them both in line. We've seen some states in the United States where that has fallen apart, and the state governments have decided to curtail the projects and bring them to an end. I think some of our European counterparts, in the past at least, it's a little bit more difficult as they're integrating their European systems. When they had just one government to contend with, not a lot of regional effects, it was easier to make decisions. On the other hand, they also had longer-term thinking. It was more common in Europe and more so even in Japan to have long-term visions. Our system is a little bit more cumbersome, having state and federal, but it is extremely important that the state and federal are working closely together, and we work on that all the time. We have to have the support from the federal side and the support from the state side.
Please. Okay. There are a large number of slightly more technical questions that have been asked. I'll sort of try and summarize one class of them, which really has to do with the redistributions that take place as a part of the investment in high-speed rail. I mean, one way to ask the question is that a lot of places near rail stations all of a sudden become much more expensive properties, and a lot of places where there are no rail stations become yet less expensive properties. Think about that on a regional level or a national level. How important are these redistributional issues, and are there things that you can do, actually do, or would like to do to address some of the capricious redistribution that goes on, or might go on? This is directed towards you, Betty.
Redistribution can matter a lot in terms of transportation impact. There can be as much as 30% difference for people who match up in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, depending on where they're living. And what kinds of options are available to them. So if people who are similarly situated otherwise live in a place where there's transit, walkability, lots of mixes of uses, and opportunities to use high-speed rail for the occasional trip that they're going that's a longer distance, they're likely to make use of those things. That doesn't mean they're not going to own cars. It doesn't mean that they're not going to drive cars some of the time, but it does mean that they'll move around and do this. Clearly, any kind of linear transportation system is going to have positive impacts around the nodes and relatively negative impacts around the line where you don't have access, but you have the impact. And the idea is you want to have enough positive impact around the nodes that it offsets the negative impacts around the line. And that's part of the strategy that you'd want to follow if you're trying to maximize your benefits. And that's also the strategy, of course, that you'd want to follow if you're trying to maximize economic return by getting investors to join in and, say, helping to develop stations where, stations these days could be shopping centers or part of shopping centers, if you will, or part of business complexes. So there are those kinds of opportunities for selective location. That, in turn, has the potential to change the markets. Some of us who spend our time in the coastal cities have tended to think of cities like Fresno as sleepy little burgs. I can remember when Denver was considered a sleepy little burg with a very marginal economy, and they kind of changed that. So there are ways of changing the economies of places. I can remember when a lot of San Francisco was a Navy base and kind of a rough town. Not the kind of place that you thought is a chi-chi place to go have dinner and shop. So places change over time, and so those opportunities are there. They can change for the better for some people and for the worse for others. If you're somebody who's thinking about whether you can pay your rent, the idea of having rent in the area go up a lot is a scary thing, not a positive thing to you. And that's an income distribution issue that I think we have to deal with and address if we're concerned about social equity.
I have 3 points.
Go ahead, please.
Well, I want to make 3 points. In terms of selling high-speed rail, it is important to broaden the base as much as possible in terms of having people see that there's a benefit to high-speed rail, even though they may not be a user. And part of our communications campaign for California was to the people that were sitting in traffic in cars who could identify with an investment in high-speed rail as a benefit for them because more people would be off the highways and they might continue to drive. So you're appealing to the automobile driver as well as the public transit driver or rider. So that's a very important messaging question, really, to make sure that everybody understands that they benefit even though they may not be a potential rider. High-cost centers actually benefit by the shrinkage in geography where they can draw on a larger employment base. So those expensive areas really benefit by having a broader base to draw on for employment. In fact, for example, in the Northeast Corridor, we bring Hartford 2 hours closer to New York. Right now, you're 4 hours from New York City with any kind of transportation mode, whether it's regional air, driving, or whatnot. With high-speed rail, you're well under 2 hours from Manhattan. So Hartford actually can become an employment provider for New York, which continues to grow as a financial center. The other point I was going to make escapes me, but anyway.
Well, there's a large number of other interesting questions that we just don't have time to get to, but that's what we have coffee breaks for. So I'll now declare a 20-minute coffee break, and we will reconvene at 8 minutes after. Thanks very much.